Taiwan, a magnificent island, hailed by many as a beacon of democracy in a region plagued by non-democratic regimes. Visitors to Taiwan not only appreciate its natural beauties. They visit gardens, museums, and temples, and enjoy a millennia-old Chinese culture. There has been no cultural revolution in Taiwan, and old Chinese treasures have been preserved for the benefit of all humanity. The rich variety of religions present in Taiwan testifies that, unlike other countries in the area, religious liberty is affirmed and protected. Yet, on December 19, 2021, visitors to Taipei noticed thousands of people in the streets, protesting that for 25 years they had not been protected by democracy and their right to religious liberty had been violated. These people also protested in the United States, in front of representative offices of Taiwan. What is going on? Is Taiwan really a democracy that protects freedom of religion or belief? Those who worked to produce this movie are good friends of Taiwan. As the Bible says in the book of Proverbs, a truly good friend will openly correct you. Those who pretend that all is well in Taiwan are not its real friends. All that glitters is not gold there. If problems are not corrected, they will play in the hands of Taiwan's enemies. Taiwan's main problem is corruption in its bureaucracy. Although anti-corruption plans have been implemented, Taiwan still ranks comparatively high in global statistics about corruption. Among the most corrupt sectors of Taiwan's bureaucracy is the National Taxation Bureau, NTB. Experts have identified the root cause of this corruption in the system of bonuses. Tax bureaucrats receive high bonuses after they enforce tax bills against taxpayers. This system creates a powerful incentive to issue high tax bills and quickly enforce them and pocket the bonuses, whether they are right or wrong. Scholars and human rights activists have called for the abolition of the bonus systems, mentioning several tragic cases where victims of tax injustice committed suicide. However, these voices were not heard. On the contrary, on Monday, January 24, 2022, it was announced that hundreds of millions of US dollars would be allocated again to the Ministry of Finance as a bonus budget. There were widespread protests in Taipei by tax reform activists, but to no avail. As the United Nations have noted, corruption is a typical problem of societies that transition from authoritarian to post-authoritarian political systems. It is difficult for authoritarian bureaucrats to adapt to the new system, and it is impossible to dismiss all of them. Old habits die hard, and bureaucrats who were accustomed to be almost omnipotent are not happy to relinquish their power. They are even less happy to be publicly denounced for their past abuses. This is the problem called in United Nations documents transitional justice. A true transitional justice implies that when an authoritarian regime is replaced by a democratic one, past violations of human rights are publicly acknowledged, perpetrators are brought to justice, laws are reformed, and victims are indemnified. The experience of many countries proves that transition from an authoritarian to a democratic regime does not happen overnight. Taiwan is no exception. In Taiwan, martial law was abolished on July 15, 1987. But this did not mean that the next day Taiwan became a full-blown democracy. The party that was in power in 1987 remained in power, alone or in coalitions, and controlled either the presidency or the parliament or both, until 2016. This obviously made transitional justice difficult. Transitional justice was one of the demands of the thousands who protested on December 19, 2021. Who are they? What is their case all about? Why do they protest? We will now try to answer these three questions. In the last few years, scholars and human rights activists throughout the world have often heard the name of these protesters: Taiji men. What is Taiji men? Taiji men is a menpai, similar to a school of Qigong, martial arts, and self-cultivation. Dr. Hong Taozu, the Grand Master, Zhang Menren, of Taiji men, has inherited the wisdom of esoteric Taoism and studied Qigong, martial arts, medicine, yin-yang philosophy, life wisdom, and heart kung fu since a very young age. After martial law was lifted in Taiwan, he started to widely accept disciples, teaching them a path to good health and happiness. There are now 15 Taiji men academies. Dr. Hong also promoted high-profile initiatives for world peace and brought traditional Taiji men culture abroad through over 3,000 cultural events and martial arts performances. Dr. Hong has visited more than 100 countries and has become a familiar figure in international peace gatherings and initiatives held at the United Nations. In 2014, Taiji Men was part of a coalition that launched the movement of an era of conscience. The initiative was praised by offices of the United Nations and the heads of state of several countries, with the participation of people in 200 nations, and eventually led the UN to proclaim April 5 as the International Day of Conscience. Taiji Men includes Dizzy belonging to several different religions. Although its origins are clearly rooted in esoteric Taoism, it does not try to convert believers of other faiths to Taoism. The heart of Taiji Men's spiritual worldview is the harmony between yin and yang, heaven and earth, heart, body, and qi energy. This harmony was part of the original purity of human beings. It was since lost, but it can be restored through exercises aimed at nurturing three aspects of health: physical, mental, and spiritual, purifying the hearts, and cultivating moral character. Through a number of Qigong and Kung Fu techniques, some of them esoteric, the Dizzy are taught to mobilize the positive energies of the universe, both nurturing them and applying them to their own health and self-cultivation. They believe that appropriate physical exercises always also have effects on the mental and spiritual dimensions. A number of Dizzy, particularly young men and women, who have already received a solid martial arts foundation, train for public performances, offered around the world on occasion of international events. For example, they performed inter alia at the Sydney Olympics in 2000 and at the opening ceremony of the Taipei Universiade on August 19, 2017. Training for such performances is not only functional to the production of spectacular martial arts presentations, but serves a spiritual purpose. By training for performing at events where love and peace are promoted, the Dizzy cultivate themselves. In turn, audiences, by enjoying the performances and the good energy radiated, gradually discover and understand Taiji Men culture. In traditional Chinese culture, a bell was rung to signal the beginning and the end of a working day. The bell's sound has also a spiritual significance in many Eastern and Western religions. Dr. Hong designed and supervised the construction of the Bell of World Peace and Love, which was first rung in Singapore in the year 2000. Today, the bell tours around the world, or did it before COVID-19, where Taiji Men invites world political, cultural, and religious leaders to ring them, making a wish for peace. Dr. Hong devotes a large part of his time to teach Dizzy, similar to disciples, and interview each of them before they are accepted as Dizzy. There is a traditional Taiji Men ceremony after the acceptance. Dizzy show their gratitude to Dr. Hong by giving gifts in the form of the so-called red envelopes to Shifu, Grand Master, as is traditional in Chinese Qigong Menpai. Everybody understands this as part of a personal relation Dizzy have with their Shifu. Several presidents and other high authorities in Taiwan have praised Taiji Men and Dr. Hong for their contribution to the public welfare of Taiwan and for being excellent ambassadors of Chinese culture throughout the world.
Under the Zhang Menren's leadership, Taiji Men has actively participated in international events, raised Taiwan's global visibility. In the future, I also hope that Taiji Men under Dr. Hong's leadership will continue to work with the government that will see Taiwan.
How is it possible that, at the same time, Taiji Men is praised and persecuted? This brings us to our second question: what is the Taiji Men case? This is something that is difficult to understand for non-Taiwanese and requires some comments about the uneasy relationships Chinese dynasties and governments, including Taiwan governments, always maintained with religious and spiritual movements that developed independently from the political power. Those who study the repression of new religious movements in Chinese history are familiar with the expression xiejiao, used to designate banned religious movements. It is usually translated as evil cults, but this translation of a term literally meaning heterodox teachings is somewhat anachronistic. Xiejiao was first used by Taoist Tang courtier Fu Ji in the 7th century CE to designate Buddhism, which he denounced as an evil heresy to be eradicated. Although xiejiao became a fully developed legal concept only in the late Ming era, Based on both theological and political presuppositions, heterodox teachings were identified since the 7th century CE as religious movements that threatened the stability of the state. What teachings were heterodox was ultimately determined by the emperor, and lists of xiejiao might change based on political grounds. The category of xiejiao was used in Republican China, established since 1911, to designate groups regarded as not supportive of the governmental reforms, particularly in the health and education fields. It continued to be used in Taiwan during the martial law period. When martial law ended in 1987, religious liberty was officially proclaimed. However, during a long post-authoritarian phase, the ruling party still expected religious organizations to actively support the government. Those who didn't were persecuted. The latest great repression of movements labeled as xiejiao, which were in fact persecuted for not supporting the ruling party when it won the first direct election of a Taiwanese president, happened in 1996. In the Chinese tradition, it was not at all unusual to single out as xiejiao spiritual movements accused, rightly or wrongly, of not being supportive enough of the power that be. The 1996 repression targeted some of the largest religious movements in Taiwan, including the Buddhist organization Fo Guangshan and Yiguan Dao, a Salvationist new religion many members of which had taken refuge in Taiwan fleeing mainland China. Notwithstanding its caution in not taking political sides, Taiji Men was also involved in the crackdown, and Dr. Hong was detained together with his wife and two dizzy. The accusations against the spiritual movements targeted in the 1996 raids were typical of the century-old tradition of the repression of xiejiao, fraud, and the use of black magic to control unsuspecting followers. Dr. Hong was falsely and ridiculously accused by a prosecutor who violated the law and abused his authority of raising goblins, a practice totally foreign to Taiji Men.
I saw a streak of shadow in his eyes. Based on my instinct from years of handling cases, I think that he might have raised goblins.
To this, the more modern accusation of tax evasion was added, with fabricated arguments. While the media and some politicians continued to claim for several years that massive cases of religious frauds had been uncovered, most of the criminal cases prosecutors had filed in 1996 ultimately did not succeed. The case against Dr. Hong and his co-defendants also failed spectacularly. On July 13, 2007, the Criminal Division of the Supreme Court of Taiwan pronounced the final acquittal of Taiji Men defendants, declaring them innocent of all charges. The Supreme Court also declared there was no tax evasion. National compensation for the wrongful detention was given to Dr. Hong and his co-defendants who had been detained. This should have been the end of the Taiji Men case. However, some National Taxation Bureau (NTB) bureaucrats decided to ignore the court decision and go on with their unjustified tax evasion action. They also knew that they could pocket significant bonuses by issuing tax bills against a large movement such as Taiji Men. Accordingly, even after the Supreme Court had concluded that Dr. Hong had committed no crimes and there was no tax evasion, they tried to maintain their tax bills for the years 1991 to 1996, claiming that the money Dr. Hong had received in these years in the red envelopes should not be considered as non-taxable gifts, but as tuition fees for a so-called cram school, a school where pupils receive crash courses, normally in preparation for exams. Different authorities intervened in the controversy, including the Ministry of Education, which has authority on cram schools, and courts of law. All declared that in the Taiji Men case there was no cram school and no tax evasion. For the second time, the Taiji Men case should have ended there, but this did not happen. In 2019, the NTB, in accordance with the ruling of the Supreme Administrative Court and the Taipei High Administrative Court, agreed that tax bills for the years 1991 and 1993 to 1996 should be corrected to zero, but maintained the tax bill for 1992, including penalties. Logically, this did not make sense, as the content of the red envelopes in 1992 was not different from the other years. The NTB relied on a technicality, that for the year 1992, and only for that year, a decision by the Supreme Administrative Court rendered in 2006 had become final. It is a general principle of law that even final decisions can and should be revised or not enforced when a new fact intervenes, in this case the verdict of the criminal section of the Supreme Court of 2007 that found Dr. Hong and Tai Ji-men not guilty of tax evasion. Nonetheless, the NTB refused to cancel the tax bill for 1992. Now the third question, why the massive Tai Ji-men protests in Taiwan? On May 5 and July 23, 2020, the Taipei High Administrative Court wrote twice to the NTB for the central area, asking them to treat 1992 as the other years were treated. This also was to no avail. In August 2020, land belonging to Dr. Hong that had been seized was auctioned by the National Enforcement Agency, then confiscated after 2 auctions were not successful. This property was important for Tai Ji-men, which planned to build a center for self-cultivation on what they consider a sacred land. Hence the protests, which also targeted what Tai Ji-men and others perceived as the unfairness of the Taiwanese tax system in general and the immoral system of bonuses. 2 questions remain. First, why did the Tai Ji-men case last longer with respect to other groups that had been involved in the 1996 crackdown on spiritual movements, and in fact is still not solved after more than 25 years? One answer is that Tai Ji-men refused to compromise with the NTB, insisting they were not guilty of tax evasion and should not pay even a single dollar for this. It may seem that this is a battle about money, but it isn't for Tai Ji-men. They spent in legal fees only, in all these years of struggles, more than they would have paid had they settled with the NTB. They did not settle for a reason of principle. By settling, they would have admitted that they had been guilty of tax evasion, something that is both against their principles and factual truth, and in their eyes would even be a connivance with the criminal actions of some rogue officials. How can they tour the world and lecture about conscience and being good citizens, and at the same time admit they evaded taxes? The second question is why a group of bureaucrats stubbornly maintained the 1992 tax bill against Tai Ji-men, even after their actions resulted in massive protests and the intervention of international human rights organizations. A problem of international image was created for Taiwan, precisely at a moment when, because of the international context, Taiwan needs all foreign friends it can mobilize. One answer we often heard from Tai Ji-men dizzy is that greedy bureaucrats simply wanted to pocket the bonuses. This is certainly true, but is only part of the story. Ultimately, the Tai Ji-men cases and protests are not about taxes or money. They are about freedom of religion or belief. Tai Ji-men was not raided in 1996 and persecuted ever since, because the authorities really suspected it was guilty of tax evasion. In fact, in 2021, a sensational testimony emerged proving that those who started the Tai Ji-men case knew that the accusation of tax evasion was fabricated. In a video, the late tax collector Shi Yusheng was heard confessing that prosecutor Ho Quan-jen, the main instigator of the persecution of Tai Ji-men, told him to lie to fabricate a false tax case against Dr. Hong and the movement. Why was the lie fabricated? The root cause was the attempt to destroy a spiritual movement that taught its disciples to think with their own heads. Authoritarian bureaucrats and corrupt officials are always afraid of those who dare think independently and follow their own conscience. Prosecutor Ho and others wanted to teach a lesson that no independent organization that refused to actively and unquestioningly support the powers that be in Taiwan would be tolerated. This is why they tried to destroy Tai Ji-men. This is also why thousands in the world admire and respect Dr. Hong and Tai Ji-men. This is why hundreds of scholars and human rights activists support the Tai Ji-men cause. This is why the case of Tai Ji-men was repeatedly denounced in international forums, including at the United Nations.
In June 2021, we brought to attention to the Human Rights Council the case of the Tai Ji-men. We denounce how the tax weapon was used to arm Taiji men. We enlisted and denounced the unscrupulous means used by the Taiwanese government in its attempt to destroy the Taiji men movement. In September, at the 88th Human Rights Council session, we renewed our appeal for Taiji men. This time, we enlightened the confiscation of this Taiji men place of worship by the Taiwanese government.
Those in Taiwan who believe this protest will simply go away with the passing of time are wrong. Protests have now lasted for more than 25 years. As the title of a book about the case suggests, the youth of more than one generation has been stolen, as they had to spend their best years asking time and again for a justice denied. But they did not give up. Generation after generation of Taiji men will continue to fight until the case is solved. More and more in the world will support them. In this sense, we are all Taiji men.